No one noticed the rollerblade at first. It sat half-buried beneath cracked radios, bent picture frames, and yellowed license plates inside a narrow junk shop off a forgotten state highway. Dust had settled so thick on its surface that its original color was hard to tell. One wheel was missing. The strap hung loose, chewed through as if cut in a hurry. To anyone else, it was trash. To the woman standing frozen in the doorway, it was something else entirely. Because etched faintly into the plastic, scratched so deep it had survived decades of neglect, were 3 letters she had once watched a 12-year-old boy carve with a kitchen knife while sitting on the front porch steps. Letters she had not seen since the day her son never came home. But none of that mattered yet. Because 20 years earlier, on a quiet weekday afternoon in 1995, a boy walked out of his house with one rollerblade under his arm and vanished without leaving a single confirmed trace behind. The boy lived in a modest town surrounded by rail yards, old factories, and wooded backroads where nothing ever seemed to happen. The kind of place where neighbors knew which cars belonged on which streets, and where children rode freely until the streetlights flickered on. He was 12 years old. Quiet, observant, not the type who ran away, not the type who broke rules. That morning, he had woken up late for school. His mother remembered it clearly, not because anything went wrong, but because everything felt painfully normal. He complained about cereal going soggy. He tied his shoes too slowly. He asked if he could stop by a friend's house later to return a borrowed video game. There were no arguments, no slammed doors, no final words heavy with meaning, just routine. After school, he came home briefly, dropped his backpack near the couch, and changed clothes. He told his mother he was heading out for a while. Not far. Just the neighborhood. He carried one rollerblade instead of 2, something he often did when the other needed repairs. He said he'd be back before dinner. She watched him step off the porch. That was the last confirmed sighting. When he didn't return by sunset, his mother wasn't alarmed. He was 12. Kids lost track of time. By nightfall, concern crept in. By midnight, fear took over completely. Police were called just after 1 a.m. Officers searched the nearby streets, alleyways, and wooded paths with flashlights. Friends were questioned. Neighbors checked sheds and garages. The route he usually took was walked again and again. Nothing. No dropped shoe. No blood. No witnesses. The only detail investigators kept circling back to was the rollerblade. Why had he taken only one? The search escalated quickly. Within 48 hours, the case drew regional attention. Volunteers combed abandoned rail lines. Dive teams checked narrow creeks. Helicopters passed overhead, rattling windows in the early mornings. His photograph was printed on flyers taped to phone poles and storefronts. A school assembly was held. Teachers cried openly. Search dogs followed his scent from the front porch down the sidewalk, and then stopped abruptly near an intersection less than half a mile from home. As if he had stepped into a vehicle. That detail changed everything. The case was no longer treated as a simple disappearance. It became a suspected abduction. 4 years, his mother lived inside the search. She learned police terminology she never wanted to know. She kept notebooks filled with dates, names, and rumors. She called in tips herself, sightings in other towns, boys who looked similar, stories that never held up under scrutiny. Every birthday passed like a reopened wound. When 10 years went by with no answers, the case was officially reclassified as cold. But something unexpected happened around that time. A newly assigned investigator reviewed the file and noticed a detail that had been overlooked during the chaos of the early years: the rollerblade manufacturer. The model was uncommon. It had been sold only for a short time and primarily through independent sporting goods stores. The investigator contacted the company, hoping to narrow down distribution. It didn't lead to the boy, but it reignited attention. Age-progressed images were released. His face, older, heavier, unfamiliar, circulated again on television and online forums. The public was reminded of the case for the first time in years. Tips poured in. None were conclusive. Still, for a brief moment, it felt like the search had resumed. Then it faded again. Life moved forward for everyone except the woman who had watched her son walk away. She never moved houses. She never threw away his things. The second rollerblade, its match, sat untouched in a closet for 2 decades. And then, 20 years after the disappearance, she took a short trip out of state. It wasn't planned as anything meaningful. Just a change of scenery. A few days away to clear her head. On the second afternoon, she wandered into a cluttered junk shop near a highway exit, one of those places where nothing was organized and everything smelled faintly of oil and dust. She wasn't looking for anything. Until she saw it. A single rollerblade. Old. Scratched. Broken. And marked with 3 carved letters she had memorized long ago. Her hands began to shake. She asked the shop owner where it came from. The answer was vague. A bulk purchase. And estate cleanout. He couldn't remember which. When she asked to take it down from the shelf, the shopkeeper hesitated. Said it wasn't for sale. Said it was already promised to someone else. Her voice cracked when she insisted. The letters were still there. Deep. Uneven. Carved by a child's hand. She left the shop and called police from her car. By the time officers arrived, the rollerblade was gone from the display. And the shop owner suddenly remembered nothing at all. What happened next would reopen a case buried for 2 decades. But it would also reveal something far more unsettling. Because that rollerblade wasn't just a memory. It was evidence. And someone had been hiding it in plain sight. The call came in just before dusk. A local patrol officer answered first, assuming it was another mistaken sighting, another hopeful parent confusing grief with recognition. But when the woman on the line said her name, the tone changed immediately. She wasn't calling with a theory. She was calling with an object. Within an hour, 2 officers arrived at the junk shop she had just left. The storefront looked the same as it had earlier that afternoon. Windows cluttered, open sign flickering, but something was off. The display shelf where the rollerblade had been sitting was now empty, wiped clean in a way that stood out against the surrounding grime. The shop owner denied everything. He claimed there had never been a rollerblade in the window. Said the woman must have been mistaken. Said people often confused items in his store because of the clutter. But when officers pressed him, asking about bulk purchases, estate cleanouts, suppliers, his answers shifted. Timelines changed. Details blurred. And when they asked to review security footage, he said the cameras hadn't worked in years. That alone wasn't enough for a warrant. But it was enough to make a call. 3 states away, a cold case investigator recognized the name immediately. Ethan Cole. Missing since 1995. Age 12. The case file was pulled from storage that same night. By morning, it was no longer dormant. Ethan's mother was interviewed at length. She described the rollerblade in detail. Scratches, wear marks, the missing wheel, the initials carved near the ankle strap. She explained how Ethan had begged to personalize them when he first got them, how she'd scolded him for using a knife, how she had watched him carve the letters anyway. She described the matching rollerblade still sitting in her closet at home. When investigators compared her description to old photographs, something clicked. The damage patterns matched. The model matched. The time period matched. There was no reasonable explanation for how Ethan's rollerblade had ended up hundreds of miles away, unless someone had taken it with him. For the first time in 20 years, law enforcement publicly confirmed what they had long suspected but never proven. Ethan Cole's disappearance was no accident. Someone had been involved. And someone, somewhere, had kept that rollerblade. Investigators returned to the junk shop with a warrant 2 days later. The store was stripped room by room. Back storage areas were searched. Receipts were collected. Old ledgers were seized. Officers found dozens of untagged items, tools, toys, clothing, none properly documented. But they didn't find the rollerblade. What they did find was more troubling. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet were handwritten notes, lists of items acquired over decades. Some entries were vague. Others were disturbingly specific. One line stood out. Kids' gear, mid-90s, cash. No names. No dates. Just that. The shop owner was brought in for questioning. He stuck to his story at first. Claimed he bought items from auctions, storage units, estate sales. Said he couldn't possibly track where everything came from. But when investigators showed him Ethan's missing persons photo, 12 years old, slight build, familiar face, his composure cracked. He looked away. He asked for water. He asked how old the case was. That question alone raised alarms. As pressure mounted, another development shifted the case again. A retired search and rescue volunteer contacted police after seeing the news segment about the rollerblade. He said something about the case had always bothered him, something he hadn't spoken about in years. Back in 1995, during the early days of the search, he had been assigned to a wooded stretch near an old service road outside town. Late in the evening, long after most volunteers had cleared out, he noticed fresh tire marks leading off the road into the brush. At the time, investigators dismissed it. There were many vehicles in the area during the search. But the volunteer remembered something specific. One of the tire tracks overlapped a shallow groove in the dirt, thin, curved, evenly spaced. Like the mark left by a rollerblade wheel. The detail had never made it into the official report. Police revisited the area. 2 decades had erased most physical evidence, but ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbances in the soil consistent with a vehicle having stopped there briefly. Nothing buried. Nothing recoverable. Still, it reinforced a theory investigators had quietly held for years. Ethan had likely been picked up, possibly forced, into a vehicle not far from home. And whoever took him had kept at least one of his belongings. As media attention intensified, tips surged again. One came from a woman who had lived near the junk shop for years. She claimed she had once seen a nervous-looking man unloading items late at night, children's items, putting them straight into the shop's backroom instead of the front. Another tip came from a former employee who said the owner was unusually protective of certain items, especially older ones. Things he never sold. Things he never catalogued. Things he kept. Police began mapping the shop owner's movements over the past 25 years. And what they found was deeply unsettling. He had lived less than 15 miles from Ethan's neighborhood in the mid-1990s. Ethan's mother was told to prepare herself. Not because they had answers, but because they were finally getting close to someone who did. She returned home and opened the closet where the remaining rollerblade still sat. She held it for the first time in years, tracing the scratches, the worn strap. 2 rollerblades had existed. One had come home. One had traveled. And somewhere between those 2 facts was the truth about what happened to her son. The shop owner was arrested, not for Ethan's disappearance, but on unrelated charges tied to stolen property and falsified records. It was the only way to hold him while investigators dug deeper. During a late-night interrogation, an officer slid a photograph across the table. It showed Ethan. Then it showed the rollerblade. The man stared at it for a long time. Then he said something quietly, something that made the room go still. He said he didn't remember the boy, but he remembered the night he got the rollerblade. The room fell silent after the shop owner spoke. Investigators exchanged looks, careful not to react. They'd waited decades for a sentence like that, something that cracked the door just enough to see what might be hiding behind it. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the photograph of the rollerblade. He said he remembered it because it wasn't part of a lot. It wasn't from an auction. It wasn't from an estate sale. It was handed to him. Late at night. Cash exchanged. No receipt. He said the person who brought it in told him not to ask questions. That was the first time anyone admitted the rollerblade had come directly from another individual. Not indirectly. Not legally. Not innocently. The shop owner refused to give a name. He claimed he couldn't remember the man's face, only that he was nervous, spoke quickly, and kept looking toward the street as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. When pressed on why he kept the rollerblade instead of selling it, the answer was unsettling. He said something about it not feeling right. So he put it away and forgot about it. For 20 years. Detectives didn't believe him. Not fully. But they also knew something else. People who lie often mix truth into their stories without realizing it. And the truth here was simple. Ethan Cole's rollerblade had been deliberately hidden. While the shop owner remained in custody on the unrelated charges, investigators widened the scope. They went back to the early days of the search, combing through interviews and tips that had been dismissed or deprioritized. One report resurfaced, a call from 1996. A woman had reported seeing a boy matching Ethan's description near a rest stop off a regional highway. He was with an adult man. She remembered the boy because he was limping. At the time, the tip was written off as unreliable. Now, it was pulled back into focus. The rest stop was less than 30 miles from where the junk shop owner had lived in the mid-1990s, and less than 10 miles from where the tire marks had been found during the original search. Investigators began building a timeline, not of Ethan's disappearance, but of movement. If Ethan had been taken, he hadn't gone far. At least not right away. Ethan's mother was informed of the developments in stages. First, that the rollerblade was now officially considered evidence. Then, that the shop owner had admitted receiving it directly from someone. Finally, that investigators believed Ethan may have been alive for some time after he vanished. That last part was both hope and torture. Because it meant he hadn't simply disappeared. It meant something had happened to him. Something ongoing. As forensic teams examined the remaining rollerblade in her possession, they found something no one had noticed before. Inside the boot lining, beneath years of wear, was a faint smear of dark residue. Testing revealed it wasn't blood. It was oil, industrial lubricant, commonly used in mechanical work, factories, or rail yards. Ethan's neighborhood wasn't near any factories. But the area surrounding the service road, the same area where the tire and wheel marks had been found, was surrounded by abandoned industrial sites. Someone who worked with their hands. Someone who moved between places. Investigators returned to the shop owner with this information. They told him they didn't need him to remember the man's name. They just needed him to remember where he had met him. The shop owner hesitated. Then he mentioned a location he hadn't brought up before. A roadside pull-off near an old rail spur. He said that was where the exchange happened. He said he hadn't wanted to mention it because it sounded suspicious. That admission shifted the case dramatically. Because the rail spur had been searched, briefly, in 1995. But only once. And only on foot. Search teams returned to the area with new tools. Metal detectors. Soil probes. Dogs trained to detect human remains, even decades later. The land had changed. Trees had grown. Debris had accumulated. But some things hadn't moved. Buried beneath layers of rusted scrap metal and soil, teams found personal items. A cracked plastic watch. A shoe sole. And fragments of fabric consistent with clothing from the mid-1990s. None could be conclusively identified as Ethan's. But none could be ruled out either. Public reaction was swift. News outlets picked up the story nationwide. Online forums reignited. Amateur investigators dug into old records, mapping potential suspects, tracing ownership of vehicles registered near the rail spur decades earlier. Names circulated. None stuck. And then came the call that stopped everything. A woman contacted police from another state. She said she had seen the coverage about the rollerblade and the junk shop. And she recognized the shop owner. Not as a criminal, but as someone she'd seen years earlier, frequently, in the company of a man who traveled with a camper van. A man who always had a child with him. Sometimes a boy. Sometimes a girl. Always quiet. Always watching. The woman said she never questioned it at the time. She assumed it was family. Until she saw the story. Until she saw the rollerblade. And until she realized the years didn't add up. Police tracked the camper van registration through old DMV records. It had been sold multiple times, often for cash, often without proper documentation. But one name surfaced repeatedly in connection with it. A man who lived under the radar. No criminal record. No permanent address. Someone who worked temporary jobs near rail yards, factories, and scrapyards. Someone who disappeared from records shortly after the year 2000. Ethan Cole had vanished in 1995. The rollerblade surfaced 20 years later. And now, for the first time, investigators had a potential link between the two. Not a suspect, but a shadow. And shadows were often all that remained in cases like this. Late one evening, as detectives prepared to execute a search tied to the camper van's last known location, Ethan's mother received a call. They told her they might finally be close to an answer. Not closure, but truth. She sat in silence after hanging up. Then she walked to the closet. She placed the remaining rollerblade back on the shelf. And for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to believe that the silence surrounding her son's disappearance might finally be broken. But as investigators moved in on the location connected to the van, they found something that suggested the case was far more dangerous and far more complicated than anyone had expected. Because the man they were looking for wasn't gone. He was still out there. And he might not be alone. The property sat at the end of a deteriorating access road, hidden behind overgrown brush and rusted fencing that once marked the boundary of an industrial zone. From the outside, it looked abandoned, another forgotten structure swallowed by time. But investigators had learned not to trust appearances. This was the last location tied to the camper van. And possibly, the last place Ethan Cole had ever been. Law enforcement approached the site cautiously, long after sunset. Floodlights were positioned. K-9 units waited at the perimeter. There was no immediate sign of activity, no vehicles, no lights, no movement, but there were indications that someone had been there recently. Fresh tire tracks. Discarded food packaging. A fire pit that hadn't fully cooled. Someone had left in a hurry. Inside the structure, investigators found signs of long-term occupation. A makeshift sleeping area. Stacks of old newspapers. Clothing of varying sizes, some far too small for an adult. In one corner, partially concealed beneath a tarp, they found tools consistent with rail and mechanical work. Oil containers. Rags stained dark with grease. And then, something else. A box. Inside were personal items, objects that immediately raised alarms. A child's bracelet. A broken toy. A pair of worn sneakers, mismatched, heavily aged. There were no bodies. No remains. No definitive proof tying any of it directly to Ethan. But the pattern was unmistakable. Forensic teams worked for days. Nothing produced DNA conclusive enough to stand up in court. Time had erased what evidence might once have existed. Exposure, decay, and movement had all done their damage. The man connected to the camper van was gone. Once again, just ahead of the search. When the news reached Ethan's mother, she didn't cry. She had cried enough over the years. Instead, she asked one question. Did you find proof he was there? The answer was honest. They couldn't say for sure. But they couldn't say he wasn't. As the investigation continued, law enforcement released a carefully worded statement to the public. They confirmed the rollerblade discovery was authentic. They confirmed new evidence had been found. And they confirmed that Ethan Cole's disappearance was being treated as an active homicide investigation, even though no body had ever been recovered. That classification mattered, because it meant the case would never be closed. Behind the scenes, detectives continued to chase the shadow of the man tied to the camper van. They uncovered reports from other states. Vague complaints. Welfare checks. Sightings that never turned into arrests. Children seen with him. Then gone. Always just enough distance to avoid certainty. Just enough silence to avoid consequence. Ethan's case became part of something larger. Not a single disappearance, but a pattern. One that stretched across decades and locations, leaving behind only fragments, objects separated from the children who once owned them. A shoe here. A toy there. A rollerblade in a junk shop window. The shop owner was eventually convicted on the unrelated charges. He served time. He was questioned again and again about Ethan. He never gave a name. Whether out of fear, guilt, or self-preservation, no one could say. But investigators believed he knew more than he ever admitted. And that truth went with him when he went silent. Years later, the junk shop closed. The building was torn down. The space became just another empty lot beside the highway. But the rollerblade, the one Ethan's mother had identified, remained locked away in an evidence facility, labeled, catalogued, and preserved. Waiting. Ethan Cole has never been found. No remains. No arrest. No final answers. But his case never disappeared again. Because one ordinary object, forgotten, dusty, overlooked, proved what his mother had always known. Her son didn't vanish on his own. Someone took him. And someone, somewhere, still knows exactly what happened. Today, Ethan's name is spoken in cold case units and missing persons briefings. His photograph still circulates. His story is told, not as a mystery that faded away, but as a warning. That even decades later, the truth can surface in the most unexpected places. And that sometimes, the smallest objects carry the heaviest secrets.